Brought to you by Exabeam, I'm Steve Moore, and this is the new CISO. Rob, thank you so much for being here. As I always say, for the uninitiated, who are you and what do you do?
Well, thank you, Steve, for inviting me. My name is Rob Knoblauch, and I'm a Canadian-based information security practitioner. I've been doing this for about, 25 years. Started kind of from the bottom doing desktop support and kind of really led into the leadership position in a lot of large Canadian financial institutions as well as fleet management companies.
Now, you told me that you got into technology initially via video games.
This is true. So both video games and music are very near and dear to my heart, and I'll explain to you the story. When I was a little kid, my dad brought home something called a VIC-20 a long, long time ago. This was well before the internet days, and it kind of really resonated with both myself and my sister. My sister's also heavily into information security, and we learned things like programming. Whenever I got grounded, I had to kind of code in the VIC-20 into systems, and that eventually grew into a love for video games. And before the internet, we had things like bulletin board systems. So by the time grade 3 and grade 4 rolled around, I had a multi-node bulletin board system in my house, 4 phone lines coming in, and I was actively trading video games, and that taught me a lot about computers and actually computer security. Running your own bulletin board system is kind of like running your own website or your own infrastructure. You have user identity and access management, you have software, you have versioning and updating and patching. So all that stuff I really cut my teeth early in, kind of like in grade school. Um, and in the background, there's always been music, and music has been really near and dear to my heart in terms of being kind of my mental balance from all the stress of dealing with hackers and in the information security profession.
So you mentioned also, well, let's go into, so bulletin boards, third, fourth grade. Um, I think we're about the same age. I can remember a little before then, learning basic and sort of just playing around, even as like a first grader, drawing shapes in basic, right, and giving like basic commands, no pun intended. At the point that you're running a bulletin board system and trading games, do your parents wonder about any of your activities, or do they just say, "Hey, go and have fun with your internet friends"?
Well, it was a problem because I've been playing with the computers so much. It did affect some of my schooling, especially
Oh,
at a young age. And, they wanted to make sure I have good marks just like any parent would. But I think they had comfort in the fact that computers was the future, and
hmm
that if I was in learning computers, that's something good, and I definitely was off the streets and not kind of doing other nefarious things. So computers was a really kind of safe refuge, and it opened up the door to a lot of opportunity, both in my personal life as well as in my professional life in terms of being able to use computers. What I find really interesting in this day and age is back then computers were very much syntax. You had to learn structures of computers, and a lot of people had a really big difficulty with that steep learning curve. Now with AI and cloud code and a lot of kind of the advancements in security and computers in general, it's made the barrier to get into computers and to be really effective at programming, code development, infrastructure security a lot lower for a lot of people, which is great. And we see a lot more people now getting into cybersecurity.
absolutely. I want to go back into that barrier change because it's one that we're all sort of still taking in a lot of ways, right? That it's a lot of the things that you and I were trained on have changed dramatically. I can remember, and I've told this story before, even learning basic HTML when I was many years ago. Um, the professor at the time, or the teacher, made us do it all in Notepad. And even though that it was early days, like pre-WYSIWYG, but early days of some builders, and they're like, no, like you need to learn this like the most natural way because then you'll know what these tags and like all this stuff does. I didn't see the value in it, but I guess I was glad that they taught it that way. But that seemed like an unnecessary barrier, and now that's sort of sort of gone, right? I mean, there was time spent on this, learning this task that none of us think about today.
Can
We
you
don't.
imagine being taught to? I remember to use your example, Turbo Pascal. I remember the teacher making it write on pen and paper
Wow.
application code, and I'm like, how is this useful in any way? Like, all you're basically doing is teaching us memory syntax memorization. I don't think you need that anymore.
No, it's super low value, and it's this sort of punitive basis education that we often find ourselves in. That's this memorization game, which I was terrible at. I would do the worst in these types of scenarios. But I want to jump into that later. I want to talk a little more about your genesis. You mentioned how music played a role and counterbalances you a little bit. I think many people in this stressful world of information security kind of go into a couple different routes. Either they find some mechanism of wellness, hopefully, they find a mechanism of escapism, or they have a mechanism of almost abusive tendencies of alcohol and things like this, right? It's sort of one of the three, right? And so for me, it was more escapism, right? So I have other hobbies that I would like lock myself into to kind of leave the digital world. So for me, it's actually looking at old watches and watch collecting and authenticating watches. The mechanical things. I grew up on a farm, and so the beauty in all of that and understanding what that is. And I see patterns in things, so I help people. It's not my business, but I help them authenticate old stuff. For you, it seems like it may have been music, and you were also a DJ. So I guess the first question is, did you have a DJ? Did you have a name as a DJ that you can
I have
share?
had many DJ names, and I currently have one too named Robbie Knobs, and I still do DJ actively.
Yeah, Robbie
Act-
Knobs.
Robbie
That
Knobs. You can go
that
on
is
SoundCloud.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I play house music, and let me kind of give you the background of that story. So,
That's
my
awesome.
family moved to Chicago when I was in my late teens, and I didn't know anybody. So, I did two things. I went to school, I went to university, as well as I called up every kind of club and company and said, "Hey, I'm a DJ from Toronto. Do you have any work for me?" And to be quite honest, it turned out really well. I got a lot of gigs, and I had a couple of club residencies, and that's what I did while I was going through university in Chicago. When I moved back to Toronto, I had a choice to work for the Toronto Stock Exchange doing desktop support, or work for Le Chateau, which is a Canadian clothing company,
Right?
basically doing retail sales. And I felt that the Toronto Stock Exchange was probably a much better decision for me career-wise, and was happy to be in that role kind of in the late 90s, right before Y2K happened, which was
Yeah.
something called the Melissa I Love You virus, which I have to say is probably the first corporate incident I've ever dealt with at a very young age. Like I was around 20 at the time. And I was offered to help with it. I wrote a Lotus Notes script. We cleaned the virus out of the company rather quickly, so there was no impact to the operations. And they said, you should probably be in information security. And that's kind of what started my career in security at the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is an organization that I still hold very near and dear to my heart. Joined a company called Bird on a Wire, which was during the dot-com bubble era, a co-location facility. So this is a data center where people used to host their systems and connect to the internet. And I was responsible for everything security related. Now, the CEO happened to be a friend of mine who also happened to be in the music community who knew me from the DJing stuff. And he's like, Rob, I heard you're a security guy at the Toronto Stock Exchange. Do you want to come in and be the CISO for Bird on a Wire? And I was very young at the time, and I said, yeah, for sure, let's do that.
That is amazing. I want to stop you there. Like that is so I don't know if there's a lesson here, but but relationships, things move so much faster when there's a connection or a relationship out like a because of the connection of music is what made that decision move fast for you and the CEO both. Full stop.
Well,
I mean,
to
in my
even
opinion.
to even put that example even further, that really came into play at Bank of Montreal. And I've been lucky to have three kind of really key mentors in my life, or bosses, for lack of a better word. And the first was Vivek Kindria at Bank of Montreal. And when I interviewed him, and this was my first big bank interview, we talked about personal life, and I mentioned I was a DJ at the time. And he asked for a CD. I gave him a CD, and later on, he told me that's kind of what clinched the interview and the hiring process for me, and what allowed me to join Bank of Montreal. Because of that diverseness, he wasn't looking for just a straight security nerd practitioner. He was looking for someone a lot more well-rounded. Now, the consequence of that is, as my career kind of grew, I felt that the DJing stuff isn't great from a marketing perspective. So I kept it really quiet for about 20 years, where I kept DJing on the side, but I never really spoke about it at work.
Right.
Up until recently, where another event promoter, a fellow named Maddie from CyberX, which runs one of the Canadian events for cybersecurity, found out I was a DJ. He's like, Rob, I'd love you to DJ our event. And I said, no problem at all. And that kind of drew me back into DJing, marrying cybersecurity. But throughout my whole life, to your point, I'm not a big drinker. I kind of get really tired when I drink. And music has been that great therapeutic outlet for me to really kind of balance out the stress of the day job.
I often talk about having a section on your resume or having a way to describe yourself that falls into this idea of notables, plural, hopefully. And it's the thing, and I stress this, and I think it's valuable. I think it's helped me. I think it's helped you. And it wasn't by design, but it's what would you remember about me and the experience of interacting with me during an interview or an introduction or a business meeting. What are the things that you'd remember after I left? Because you're not going to really remember necessarily where I went to school, or maybe even not all my prior employers, maybe none of them, but you might remember a story, number one, and you might remember something that, hey, did Rob, did he write a book? Did he give a really interesting presentation? Does he have a curious hobby? Is there some other skill set that's completely different or complementary to all it is that we do? And so I think that that is a differentiator and has been by example. And I really like the idea that, hey, can I have a CD? This tells us also, this allows us to timestamp the window this conversation took place
Exactly.
at the Bank of Montreal, because there's some people here that when they see the CD logo, they don't know what that is because they're so young, they've never actually held one.
Well, I have two kids, and the floppy disk logo was a complete enigma to
Right.
them. So yes.
It's just an artifact from, yeah, it's like an old saying that, that country people use. And I can say that as a former country person, so no offense intended to anybody. So you're back at, I mean, a little bit of a bird walk here. You're kind of a little bit back into DJing.
It's never really left. It's something
Yeah.
that I do on occasion, whenever the opportunity presents itself. When I was working at the banks, they're very much have a hard line on outside of business interests. So it's
Right.
something that I do as a passion project. It's not like I'm collecting hundreds of dollars. When I was in Chicago, I was doing it professionally about 4 or 5 times a week. But then what I considered getting a real job, even though DJing is a real job, um, it's not something that you can depend on, in my opinion. It's a very competitive environment, even more so than information security. There's a lot, very few who make a successful living at
Sure.
DJing. And for those that do, I am kind of jealous of them because it's a beautiful life to live, although you're traveling and it's really hard on the body. Um, but no, like I think the career path of information security is something that I've always wanted to do. When I was a kid, a lot of people struggle with what should I do in life? Like, what should I go to school for? That's never been a problem for me. I always knew as soon as I started looking at video games and how applications are coded and how computers work, I knew this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. And it's something that has come really natural to me, as well as my sister, who's a published cloud security author. and she's very successful in zero trust and cloud security as well.
Well, let's name her and
Andrea,
what's
Andrea Knoblauch, my wonderful 3 year younger sister.
uh and do you recall the name? She's going to judge you based on the answer to this. Do you remember the name of her last book?
I think cloud security, architecture, design, and principles, but I'm not
Okay.
100% sure. It was a couple of years ago. She is
Someone
currently working for WWT,
Yeah.
formerly with SoftChoice, and WW just bought out SoftChoice.
Yeah.
And she's working with a large number of clients on their security objectives. And we still talk time to time a lot about security and bouncing ideas off each other.
I think that's a pretty special thing to have, and rare, in fact, to have both of you in the same career and so close to, and still willing to speak to one another.
Yes.
I
She's very much into music as well, by the way.
My niece is studying security at Purdue University, and
Oh, wow. Okay.
so
Very
that may
cool.
be the connection that I have there. That's similar, but she's still at university, so we're not quite in the same field yet. Hopefully, she gets into it faster than I retire, which I think maybe will never happen. So tell me a little bit. I want to go back to Bank of Montreal. So you give the guy that, we're going to talk about mentorship in a little bit. So don't go down that path quite yet.
All right.
But you give him a CD
Hmm.
of your work, and then you start there. You said you were really grateful and you hold that place in high regard. Not everybody says that about a prior employer. What was your introduction there, and what's the biggest kind of career lesson from that stage of your life?
So, actually, to tell you the truth, every company that I've worked for, I've had a fantastic experience. I can't say any one single company. It's been like, oh, I hate it, never go there again. I've been really lucky and also have had a really great number of bosses throughout my career. With Bank of Montreal, coming in really young, like in my early 20s, big bank, a lot like all the other banks were beginning to really address cybersecurity. I was coming from traditional antivirus, intrusion detection, vulnerability management, a little bit of kind of cryptography into something a lot greater, such as the SOCs that we see in this day and age, insider threat management programs. So the opportunities that were given to me to kind of build and create were absolutely amazing. I was hired to design the internet delivery channels, so working on the DMZ, creating all the internet infrastructure, and we created a beautiful internet architecture to basically host all the online banking systems, investor line, a number of other systems, as well as create kind of the processes around that. The one key takeaway from Bank of Montreal was around the practice itself. What does good information security look
Hmm.
like? What does a strong control set look like? How can you create robustness? We, how do you create resiliency? Although we didn't really call it resiliency at the time. And really, what is the gold standard to do security right? So, from a practitioner's perspective, what are the right controls? It was still junior enough for me, although I left there pretty much as a deputy CISO, where I didn't get to have to deal with so much politics. It was a really small team back then, and everyone was just kind of trying to figure it out, and it was a very collaborative type of environment. Um, so the key takeaway from both Vivek, who I consider the teacher out of the kind of the three major mentors that I've had, was the practice and basically understanding the fundamentals of information security.
For those that are just used to the cloud and just using someone else's data center, Rob used a term called DMZ. I started my career in web infrastructure, helping a company put their mainframe on the internet
Wow,
for
that's a
loan
big
applications.
project. That's a big project.
For loan applications, yeah. And so defining the DMZ, setting up the web infrastructure, load balancers, SSL certs, all
All that
this,
wonderful stuff. Yeah, that
jump
was an art. That was
boxes.
a science back then.
Yeah, yeah, we had a lot of help. There's a lot of us that were involved, but also the application code and the infrastructure and the firewall rules and all the rest. let me ask you this. I mean, that skill or that experience is becoming less and less common. Meaning, maybe if you work at a web hosting company, maybe if you work at a cloud company, you're getting into that. But it's a little bit of a dying art.
As the mainframe is in general too. We don't
Well,
see very much mainframes at all either.
most certainly. I didn't have a lot of help with. I didn't do a lot there, other than just making calls to that, right, or setting up configurations on middle tier stuff to do the query management and the queuing. But I guess my question is there a cost to that, or is that just something that we just need to forget and move on to new skills? Or do
I think
you? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think it goes kind of with the major milestones. Like to me, I started back in the mainframe era, distributed computing, virtual machines,
Mhm.
cloud, now AI, I'd say is the next major one. I think infrastructure as a commodity is definitely disappearing. I wouldn't really see much value too much in maybe a Cisco CCNE versus an AWS certificate. A lot of our infrastructure, a lot of our applications to these days are on the hyperscalers, whether it be Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. And I think those skills are extremely core to being successful in that field in this day and age. Um, More so now moving towards AI. But I think cloud is not going away. We do see some examples of companies repatriating
Hmm.
infrastructure from the cloud and putting it back on-prem for where it makes sense. But I'd say those are kind of edge use cases. And usually the larger shops are kind of doing things like that. And some large shops have still a lot of legacy infrastructure in their data center, especially companies with over like 50 to 60 years of operations. So we're also speaking very much about North America. When I look at the whole world, there's a lot of countries out there who are years behind where we are in North America, and data centers and on-prem systems are still a very much big reality for them.
No question. There are areas of the world for a number of reasons that are still very keen to have on-premise technology.
Yeah,
Um, for
definitely.
for a vast number of reasons, it's very very common. The curiosity of cloud and the adoption is growing in those areas. So, for example, there's still a lot of use in the Middle East of on-prem, but there's
Yeah.
also rapid adoption and speed, and really a hunger to learn a lot of this and to improve. And honestly, sometimes without the technical burden that we had, there's they're sort of jumping, they're leaping over some of what we've had to deal with. When did you move into leadership? When did you actually take into to where you're certainly you've owned many programs and built a lot of programs, but when did you sort of roll in and hey, I got a big staff now?
My whole career has really been based on not saying no when it comes to promotions, interviews, opportunities. It's when my bosses ask me to do something, I say yes, no problem. When I first joined Bank of Montreal, it was just me designing the internet delivery channel. After some successes, the team grew. I was asked to kind of look at the mainframe, AS400s,
Mm.
DECVAX, systems like that. So built a little bit of a team. Mostly they were older than I was at the time. And then it kind of grew and grew and grew. So a next major milestone was all the Unix and Windows systems and growing a team even bigger. Then it was security operations. I'd say somewhere in kind of like the mid 2000s, I was put on a 18-month leadership course. And then for the rest of my careers within Bank of Montreal and Scotiabank, there's been a series of executive MBAs, leadership courses, and one thing I'm really, thankful for the banks in doing is providing me these opportunities to really round out myself from a technical individual contributor more into a leader type of individual. And it's been fantastic. I definitely love leadership. A lot of people say, "Oh, I hate HR and I hate dealing with people." That's not me. I love seeing team successes, and the happiest things that I see in my career is when staff that I've worked with or have worked for me grow and gone really successful and far in their careers. And there's a lot of really good examples in Canada of that happening. So I'm really appreciative again of the leadership opportunity. Um, and also some of the kind of things that you have to deal with at a large bank. Like some of the incidents are pretty significant. Um,
Yeah.
on page facing if you don't deal with it correctly. So that kind of level of, I don't want to use the word excitement because they were very exciting things. They were very stressful as well. But the situations which I found myself in were fantastic. One example is I have the ability to say that I took down the first phishing website in Canada. It was a phisher that was pretending to be the Bank of Montreal's online banking system, and we had to manually call up the ISP and to get the system down. And as far as I was aware, this was the first one that happened because as soon as it happened, we told all the other banks, and they kind of learned from us.
There would be a time when, I mean, well, if you were the first, I mean, there's a fair amount of legwork to running down, okay, who's hosting this? How do I contact them? How do I get them on the phone? How do I convince them that I'm being truthful? How do I influence them with no real authority?
Yeah, and there's no playbook for this stuff. In fact, no, we didn't have playbooks for anything back then.
Right.
That's one example of the maturity that our organization has kind of shown over the last 20 years is we used to treat security problems just like operational IT problems. We used to have a war room. We brought everyone who knew anything about anything into the war room to contribute, and we kind of worked the problem. Now we have these really amazing best practices, industry adopted steps that can be coded into our systems and prompt the security analysts to do the right thing. I think there's a lot of maturity in that side of the profession now around incident management. And there's some companies who are absolutely amazing at incident management in the whole industry, especially with cyber insurance, where they kind of really want to make sure that you're good at incident management, that you have a breach coach, that you have
Sure.
gone through tabletop exercises. I think that's really one good thing that's kind of come out in the last few years.
Um, well, to that end, I mean, that accidentally, it's something that I've done a little bit of on that. Why do you think companies need? I'll ask you this. It's not meant to be a tricky question, but maybe it kind of feels that way. Why do companies need a breach coach? Like, shouldn't they? If this is well known, and I mean, this is I'm being a little bit tricky in the question, I guess, but I mean, if we have playbooks for these things and there's best practices, why via cyber insurance or anything else? Why? What's the incentive to have a breach coach to come in if they've had a breach?
So I know how to fix my car. I can do basic things like oil changes. If the car gets in an accident, I can say, oh, wow, the car's in an accident. But I'm not a car mechanic. And the car
Mm.
mechanic could see what's wrong with the car and understand, oh, wow, there's actually some more systemic issues. I'm going to use that analogy in terms of at the banks, I've dealt with incidents all the time, small incidents, big incidents. But am I an expert in it? I wouldn't say so. There are companies out there, like I'm just going to drop the big ones like Mandiant and CrowdStrike and
Yep.
Signia. They're all really good at working with different verticals and different clients, as well as the different threat actor groups. And I've seen some examples where, because of their knowledge of the threat actor groups, especially when it comes to a ransomware type of event, they provided an additional value that you can't get from a client, such as, well, we've dealt with this ransomware group before. We have the decryption tool from this ransomware group before. We can use this decryption tool in your case. Or they know how to negotiate to get you more time or the less payout or the
Sure.
ability to use other examples to help guide the conversation. I'd rather work with a breach coach who is an industry veteran in how to manage this because I am definitely not smart enough to know that I'm the best at this. And if there's people who are experts, let's leverage that expertise. And usually it's paid for by your cyber insurance company because it's part of the indirect costs that come with a breach. So similar to my whole career, I try to surround myself in people who are best in breed at what they do. I know one guy who's an amazing red team pen tester. I know another lady who's really good at cryptography. I know another lady who's really great at IAM. And when it comes to these types of discussions, I defer to their expertise. I consider myself more of a generalist in this day and age, and I have some areas where I really can go deep. But in terms of bringing the best right talent at the table for the right time, I'm a huge advocate in that.
You hit on certainly on the technical bits of being familiar with the adversary, certainly setting them up for success as it relates to a remediation event. How to walk through and say, okay, how much do we really like? All of that is super important. So, how much do we know about the adversary? What's the condition and state of the network? Rapid deployment of controls. Setting them up for success. And I think even acting as a buffer to executive leadership. The crummy part that I don't like is that every breach notification letter, within about the second paragraph, notes that we've brought in outside experts to help solve the problem. That's
Hmm.
almost a universal statement.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. However, it begins to we are all now conditioned to believe that, or to feel that there's no internal existing experts, because due to the fact that we've had to call in outside experts to make everyone feel good.
Hmm.
That's my complaint as somebody who'd spent a lot of years in that role, in that place, that really kind of maybe unnecessarily rubs me the wrong way, but it's a staple. You should always call in outside help. But that's my one complaint to the non-technical folks, that it reads that way, it feels that way.
I think external help and bringing in external help, not just for incidents, but in general, is a very strategic type of lever to use. One example of also bringing in outside help is when your C level or your board is not listening to you about a certain control or a requirement that
Mm,
really needs to be put in place. And I've seen many people bring in one of the big four to basically do an audit and come up with the same recommendations that the CISO has been saying for years. But the board will listen this time because it's a third party with a
yes.
great brand. That's fine. And again, my ego is not big enough where I'm going to feel slighted about that. At the end of the day, as long as the work is getting done and we're protecting the organization, I'm not so fussed about how we get there, to be quite honest. So I've seen that being strategically of value, especially with the IR firms. Ideally, this is not the first time you're calling your IR firm in the middle of an incident. Usually, you're doing some prep work with them well before an incident happens. They understand your environment, they understand where your assets are, they understand what's material to the organization. They can help drive that decision making. So, to me, they're more of an extension of the team. And if they come up with some great ideas along the way, hey, let's table those ideas. And it's not just Rob saying it,
Right.
it's well, Mandiant's saying from a best practice perspective, we're an outlier in the market because we don't have X. That's a much easier conversation to have.
Leveraging third-party influence is always powerful in any type of negotiation, right? Or any type of transference of knowledge and trying to influence, certainly. And you bring up a really good point. I actually talk about this in some work that I do, either in writing and then in a presentation that I used to give. But it's, don't make an introduction in a crisis. And one of the things you need to do is have those relationships set up ahead of time, meaning
Mhm.
have paper with them. Even if you've not had a breach and don't suspect a problem, try to get someone out to do a basic review. Get something in your pocket that'll give you direction from people that don't make decisions in a vacuum of experience. Meaning, if you're worried about a breach, talk to breach people. You may have lots of stuff from your auditor, but get stuff from people who have actually done the work and carried the water, to help inform where you go strategically in terms of how do I train more like I'm going to need to fight in this situation, right? Where am I going to fall flat in a situation? What can I not see? What are my capabilities? That kind of thing.
One of the favorite parts of my job when I'm asked to do this is to do tabletop exercises. And I've traveled all over the world, largely with Scotiabank, to do tabletop exercises at three different levels. You have it at the board level, the C-suite level, and then what I consider the technical level. And each tabletop exercise is a little bit different. Like at the board, you're not asking how to manage out of an incident. It's more kind of board level kind of key decisions around priorities and things like this. At the C level, it is a little bit more like Dungeons and Dragons for executives. And what I've found is organizations that conduct these tabletop exercises in general, it's better than not doing it at all. Second is if they're involving their third parties, and third is if they're involving their cyber insurance provider and their breach coaches. What I've found is depending on the level of depthness in that tabletop exercise, you create a lot of incident response resiliency and robustness around breaches.
Mm,
And I've seen really successful ones with the cyber insurance provider, with the IR person, maybe a key supplier for like the call center or something like that. They've kind of uncovered a lot of logistical issues that would have been bottlenecks in responding to an incident, as opposed to just doing it with the C level, with the CFO, the CEO, the CRO, the chief of legal, because it's a little bit of a lighter conversation. It doesn't go really deep into the weeds as much. There's a lot of assumptions being made that things are just going to work out naturally. So again, to me, tabletops really kind of drive out that stuff, and all those gaps that come out of that tabletop allows you to refine your playbooks, allows you to identify those gaps in case all hell breaks loose, and how do you recover from it quickly. And also any systemic gaps that you need to address because maybe you're just not ready at all. And once this type of threat will happen, you don't have much defenses, or what I call the emperor has no clothes.
right.
So finding out through tabletop exercises I found super, super important. And I encourage every organization at least once a year with the board, once a year with the C-suite, and depending as often as needed with the technical team. To me, that's kind of like the drill exercises on a military ship. You want to
Right.
be able to load those missiles quickly. You want to be able to identify what's coming at you quickly. And the technical team is a lot where the rubber hits the road in this case.
Well, give me an example. Let's go from the bottom up, if you would. So the technical tabletop exercises. Obviously, there's 1,001 examples we could use. But what's an example of somebody that we should invite that may not be obvious, and what's maybe an example of when it's done, an indicator that it's been successful?
So I think one of the biggest contributing factors to what makes a successful response is communication. And I believe it's actually needed probably at all stages of the board, C-suite, as well as technical. But technical is where it starts. When a system is down, how do we invoke BCP, the call tree?
Mm,
How do we inform our employees not to log in or to bring in their computers with to be ready for a USB drive because we have to re-image the box? What are all the different ways that we can recover and communicate that recovery consistently without creating panic to our employees?
right.
Also making sure that they're not talking to the media. Do we have canned templates and scripts ready and available? All of these types of things that you can do proactively, I think is hugely important. In all the tabletop exercises that I've ever facilitated, the one person that usually is very active in them is whoever's in charge of communications and media relations, both internal employee as well as external. Because to me, the best organizations are ones that can communicate effectively in an incident.
Agree completely. One observation. It's not uncommon for organizations to bring in help with communications as well. So some sort of expert
PR
communicator, some
for
sort of
like,
coach.
yeah.
Now, you may or may not use that person front and center, but they will be used to, with counsel, used to shape messaging. So sometimes it's media, sometimes it's client calls. I've been, I guess I've had the good or the bad fortune in order doing a fair amount of this. Client client management is extremely important. So how do you make them feel comfortable without making them angry? So how
Hmm.
do you tell them enough, but not too much because you've got an ongoing investigation?
Is it an operational issue? Do we have a breach? At what time do we
Right.
say the right holding pattern statements? I think creating those templates in advance is super important. And often, when I'm first doing tabletop exercises, these templates don't exist. And especially when you're dealing with a large global organization that operates in different countries, you don't want people to kind of do their own thing. You want to kind of
No.
stay consistent with your messaging. So the consistency of that communications is huge in terms of a win. What I've also found is when you're creating these communications on the fly, it typically takes a long time to get approved and have all the eyes see it. So having these templates well approved beforehand and you're just creating nuances in the language to reflect the current incident at hand, I think is super important. There is one great Canadian example that I always bring up in terms of how well this was done, and this is with Maple Leaf Foods. It wasn't even cyber related. They had a listeria outbreak a little while ago. Well, it was more a while ago now. I think it was at least maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And the way they handled it from a PR campaign perspective, honestly, best practice. The CEO was very transparent in what was going on, updates regularly with as the incident progressed. And to me, that kind of consistent, frequent communications goes a long way and probably the biggest make or break in an incident.
I will say that the other point I was going to make earlier is that even if you have expert help on the communication side, so crisis management type folks, you need to give them often a security advisor to help with them
Oh,
as
for
well,
sure. Yeah.
because I've seen them go off and try to do their own thing and then prepare for media and not have anyone to help them with word choice, let's say, and it goes very badly.
Yeah.
It creates so many more problems where terminology. I've seen it happen with lawyers too, where well-meaning terminology gets added into discussions or something in print that is means something very different to a technical audience. Period. And it can cause a massive mess. And so back to that, don't make introductions, have friends, like high collaborate. The teams that I see that do the best are this sounds corny, but high collaboration.
Yeah, 100%. It's a team sport.
Yeah, 100%.
I've also found it's sensitive these days and age. Like we have a recent example where there was an incident and the response was done in English and not in French as well, and that caused a really negative impact. So it's not just the messaging, it's kind of, well, they say the medium is the message, but it's how you carry the message and making sure that it's inclusive and that you're addressing your audience in its entirety, I think is extremely important. And putting yourself in the different people in your audience of how they will interpret the message. Really tricky stuff.
Yeah.
I think the fighting the hackers part of it is actually easy compared to the communication piece.
It is that's the most solvable, and with enough effort, you can make sure they're not going to come back. You know,
Yeah.
if you're willing to make enough change, they may try to come back, but making sure that well, you know that most organizations get hit with ransomware. I think it's like 40% get hit again, right? Because they pay and then they get popped again. That number changes. It may be down to 20 now, but you can solve all of that with enough effort. With
Mhm.
enough reduction of privilege and enough lockdown, you can solve that problem. What is difficult that I see is the communication, internal and external, the management of customers, the management of government, governing bodies, licensing groups. That's the hard part. That is where you're going to create a lot of pain for yourself. So I want to switch topics because you had a really maybe even accidental breakdown. I don't know. I think it could have been intentional. You'll tell us here shortly. Where you were talking about coaches and teachers and mentorships, and you said you've always had good mentors. I think most people can't say that, but you even had kind of a rubric where you broke it down into kind of a big three.
Yeah, I've had three big ones, and
Yeah.
Vivek Bhima was one of them, and I considered the teacher. Again, security fundamentals, how to do security right. When I joined Scotiabank, much larger organization, double in size, very global in terms of different countries to work with. So understanding the collaborative nature of a global entity is something that doesn't come naturally to most people, and it definitely didn't come
Mm.
naturally to me. So I credit a fellow named Greg Thompson who hired me at Scotia, and I consider him the coach. So he was someone who can take a lot of stressful situations, a lot of issues from a team perspective, and really smooth things out and make everyone have a win-win situation or get really good compromises from the team. I think his team leadership was very effective. He's also a really big hockey guy. And a lot of his analogies were from a sports kind of perspective. And that's kind of why I called him the coach, because he very much had a coach mindset. So when I'm looking at my problems in my day as a leader, I kind of have so far two lenses. I have the lens of the teacher, and then I have the lens of the coach.
Yeah.
The one of the oldest CISOs in Canada is a fellow named Steve Hawkins. He's been a Canadian CISO for about 40 years. There were two. There was Rosa Caputo and Steve Hawkins. And with Steve Hawkins, he was kind of my second big boss at Scotiabank. He was the one who promoted me into the Deputy CISO role and really allowed me to kind of stretch my wings from a global perspective. And I call him the general because he was one of those guys who was extremely passionate about information security, about doing the right thing, about protecting the bank. And I think that's fantastic. Very selfless person. He really put the company before himself in any decision that he ever made. He was also very passionate about making sure that people were doing the right thing and had no problem calling out mistakes and poor performers. He was very what I call authoritative in terms of this is what needed to be done, this is when we're going to do it, I'm going to follow up with you at 8 o'clock in the morning. He would call me at any time and any hour to get things done. He was a guy who I would follow into war for. That's why I call him the general, because he knew how to neutralize the enemy as quick as possible and what the right solutions were to solve the problem. And the way, with the passion and the vigor that he did it, to me was very admirable. Some people struggled with that, to be quite honest. When you work with a really hard type of guy who really wants to get things done, they take it personally. People can't take criticism and feedback. He once said, I speak third world English. I'd like to think I'm very articulate, but the feedback and the criticism that he's given me has allowed me to really become a much stronger type of person, both mentally as well as my quality of work has significantly improved. He's someone who I have a lot of love for, to be quite honest. He's a great guy, and we're still good friends. I'm friends with all three of these gentlemen that I'm speaking of. But in terms of the one guy who really made an impact in terms of my leadership style, I would have to say is Steve Hawkins. And it's another lens. So I have now the lens of the general, the teacher, and the coach. And I find that depending on the situation, I apply the different lens, and usually it works out.
For someone listening that might not have maybe any of the three, or maybe have not even thought about that lens, you're looking at this retrospectively, right? You're able to kind of apply this label, but I think each of these at different phases of your career are equally important, and maybe you need them all equally all the time, but you could also kind of block into them. You could do them in a linear way. Is it important to have all three at the same time, or is it because I think that there's having the attributes as a human to be able to call on each of those archetypes is important. So I'll set the stage there. Is it important to have all of those out of the gate?
It largely depends on the organization you're working for, and let me qualify that statement. I think CISO is actually it's my favorite job. Like, this is what I was born to do, and I love doing it. But I think it's an absolutely brutal job, and I worry for a lot of people who want to get into this thinking it's a glamorous career that it's definitely not. A lot of it is related to politics and stress, like depending on where you're in the organization.
Yeah.
A lot of CISOs report to the CIO. One of the traditional type of frictions that you have is the CIO wants to move fast, the security guy wants to move things securely. Sometimes they don't line up. Security people with developers often don't see eye to eye on a lot of different issues. Are you willing to put your ego aside and learn and collaborate? And you may not be right all the time. And even if you are right, it may not even matter, to be quite honest. And you're willing to live with the compromises and the puts and takes and which battles to pick and which wars to win. That's not an easy answer. And a lot of it is negotiation. A lot of it is soft skills. I'd say it's leadership for sure. It's strategic thinking. I would say that I'm a much better security hacker practitioner guy than a leader. I'm always striving to be a much better leader. I'm also trying to expand my knowledge. But I think the soft skills in navigating an organization and playing those politics is a much harder part of the job than the actual protecting the company. And the advice I'd give to CISOs is have a strong trust relationship with who you work for,
Mm.
because you have to be able to have those conversations. You have to be able to take that criticism when you're doing something wrong or you're pushing something that doesn't need to be pushed or there's another priority, and also understand the business strategy that your company is working towards so you're aligned with it, as opposed to kind of doing your own thing just for the sake of protecting the company. One example is, and the traditional example we use in our industry is brakes are the enabler for a car to be fast. Very much that analogy applies. You are the brakes, but you can also make the car stop and not move at all. So, how do you achieve that balance? And sometimes you also just have to walk away. There's some situations where you're like, you know what? I can't take this risk. And this is where things like D&O and liability insurance and a lot of other kind of plan B risk mitigation strategies come into play. And also, it's one of the reasons why the CISO tenure is anywhere from like a year and a half to 4 years, just because it is a very political role, at least right now. We don't have a clear defined mandate like a CFO or a CRO would in very many cases. So that lens has helped me kind of stay alive, I believe, and really tackle some of those big problems. But I'm still, in my opinion, just a junior. I'm always trying to learn from really strong leaders out there, and there's a lot of really great examples in our industry and outside of our industry. I actually have a whole library of leadership books from people like Colin Powell and from Values to Action by Baxter and
Mhm.
General Hillier from Canada's Army. And I'm still trying to learn as much as I possibly can. What I do know is the most important thing is being a good human and being good to other people, because everyone is here to work, I believe. The ones that aren't usually don't survive too long.
Right.
Everyone has families, everyone has personal lives. And if you're spending at least 8 hours a day with someone, I'd rather spend 8 hours a day with people who I like to work with and who operate as a team and who operate collaboratively. So I
Absolutely.
guess my kind of no a-hole policy is kind of the overriding artifact.
You may have covered the question already, but we're almost at time, and that means we're going to put forth and propose the final question we ask every guest, which is pursuant to the name of our show, the new CISO. What does being a new CISO mean to you? You've covered it, a lot of it already, um, but what's the one thing that you might underscore related to that?
I think we're in one of those really exciting times right now in our humanity's career trajectory in general, where AI is really changing the dichotomy of how a lot of things are being done, creating a lot of automation, a lot of ability for people to create and do things that they weren't able to do before, maybe not at such a fast pace. I think it's so exciting, the technical change that we're going through right now. And if you're a new CISO about to kind of embark in your career in this change, the length that you have is unbelievable in terms of what you're going to be able to accomplish. A lot of what we spend time on is the basics, like coding systems and
Mhm.
documenting policies and writing firewall rules and the mundane stuff. I kind of look at it as a pioneering of information security. Now we have all this advanced technology, which makes a lot of that kind of not so fun commodity work go by the wayside. So you can spend a lot of time doing strategy, doing leadership, doing amazing things and advancing your company. I think now is a great time to be a CISO, to be quite honest. Politics will always be there. Working in a large company, that will always be there, regardless of what profession you're in. But the ability to actually make an influence in a company as a CISO now has been greater than any time in the past, in my opinion.
Very well said. And Rob, thank you so much for all your time today and for being a part of this virtual leadership, virtual mentorship experiment.
Steve, thank you very much for the invite. I love the discussion, and have a great day.
Thanks.
That's it for this episode of the new CISO. Thank you for listening. Check out more episodes on exabeam.com/podcast, and remember to rate, review, and subscribe to get brand new episodes first.